Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Alexander, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's event. I would like to begin by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners of the land from which I am speaking to you today. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and I extend that respect to all Indigenous people and communities throughout Australia. Today's conversation has been organised by Elios Justice. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, we are a Right to Life initiative based at the Faculty of Law, Monash University, and conduct evidence-based research, teaching, and advocacy on the death penalty and other forms of state-sanctioned killing. Today, we will be examining the situation in Belarus. Belarus is the last country in Europe to implement the death penalty, but as we will explore, judicial executions represent but the tip of the iceberg of the killings in which the Belarusian regime is potentially complicit. Joining us to unpack this topic is Dr. Anais Maran, the incumbent United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus. She's been holding this pro bono mandate since 2018, making this her final year in office. Anais is a Warsaw-based freelance consultant specializing in international relations, Russian, and border studies. She currently works as associate expert with the Collegium of Eastern Studies in Wrocław, Poland, as reference point on Russian sharp power in a transnational research project on mapping threats to democracy in the European Union. Anais holds a PhD from Sciences Po in Paris. She is an associate fellow with the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, London, and has previously worked with various European think tanks, notably the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, Helsinki, and the European Union Institute for Security Studies, Paris. She has contributed various policy papers and recommendations on the EU's Eastern neighbourhood policies to EU governments and institutions, and has published extensively on Belarusian domestic politics, foreign and security policies, EU-Belarus relations, and political and military integration within the Union state of Belarus and Russia. Anais, thank you very much for joining us today. Before commencing our discussion, I would like to take this opportunity to mention that today's event will conclude with a Q&A session. So we invite all our audience to submit any questions that you might have via Zoom's Q&A function, and we will do our best to get to those at the conclusion of today's event. So Anais, to begin, could you give us an overview of the various types of state-sanctioned killing that are currently occurring in Belarus?
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Chris, for your introduction. Thank you to Elios Justice for the invitation. Thank you for your interest in Belarus, because, as you know, the situation with human rights there, and that's why my mandate exists, has been going from bad to worse. When it comes to state-sanctioned killings, I would remind of four aspects, which I think are particularly concerning. First, as you remember, in August 2020, following the last re-election of Mr. Lukashenko as president, there's been protests, massive peaceful protests to contest this re-election, the results of the official results of the vote. And they were followed by massive use of unjustified and disproportionate violence, which resulted in several deaths. The OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights of the UN, has established a special mandate to investigate the human rights violations that occurred in the context of these 2020 elections. And this team, this OHCHR examination on Belarus, has concluded that at least eight deaths amounted to illegal deaths, and 16 more are under investigation. The problem being that these kind of events are not being prosecuted in Belarus, where the justice system is not independent. The second element, which has been a serious matter of concern for my mandate, for other UN special procedures is the multiplication of deaths in custody. If you remember, the death of Mr. Navalny in prison, a Russian prison 2 months ago, has raised a lot of emotion, but at the same time in Belarus, the number of people who are considered by human rights defenders as political prisoners who have died in custody in unclear circumstances is also very important. It's usually, unfortunately, goes past the international attention, below the radar, but we have recorded, again, since 2020, at least 5 deaths in custody of these political figures, and in circumstances which are still under investigation, but which could amount to unlawful deaths for lack of adequate medical care, or eventually as a result of torture, which is widespread in Belarusian prisons, as in many other countries of the post-Soviet space. The third issue, which has been there for a long time, is enforced disappearances, which, as you know, could amount to possible deaths. There are like 2 sides to this problem in Belarus. First, it concerns very famous cases which occurred in 1999, 2000 of former interior minister, the former prime minister and head of the Central Electoral Commission, and two more people, so 4 persons at least, who were abducted in 1999, 2000, and eventually killed, from what we know, from what investigative journalists have evidenced. But at the level of the international community, there's no confirmation, and no, there's been even a case prosecution in Switzerland, in the country of exile, of one of the alleged perpetrator. He himself made these revelations to Deutsche Welle in 2019 about having been part of a special rapid response unit, killer unit of the government of Belarus to eliminate these people. And his revelations fits the picture of what special investigators from the Council of Europe have already came up with in terms of conclusions. And even the head of the death squad is identified, etc. But last September, a trial was held in Belarus against this member of this death squad, but the court concluded that because the defendant had made contradictory statements, at some point claiming that he was a mere witness, and anyway, because the government also could not be, the involvement of the Belarusian government in the disappearances could also not be proven beyond reasonable doubt, because it was not represented in the proceedings, of course. The person was eventually acquitted, and it had a high resonance, and there were a lot of hopes with regards to this trial back then in Switzerland, because it was the first one held pursuant of universal jurisdiction for this type of crime. But it's also a painful reminder that in these cases, even after a lot of evidence has been gathered by other people, the justice system, even internationally, is not necessarily able, in the absence of a corpse of a culprit, to fight impunity and to hold those responsible to account. And the fourth issue, which pertains to these whole problems in Belarus of state-sanctioned killings, I would say, is the numerous deaths of undocumented migrants at the border with Poland, at the Belarusian-Polish border, which have occurred since 2021 in a context which I am not entitled to investigate in my capacity as independent expert for the UN, because when such That's happened also as a result of pushback from one country for which I don't have a mandate, Poland. This is the responsibility of another mandate, a thematic mandate, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Migrants, who did visit both sides of the border, came up with some conclusions, but unfortunately also didn't enjoy the full cooperation of both governments and could not clearly determine the responsibility of each side in these deaths, and the numbers are not fully clearly known. And each time, I live myself in Poland, and each time when the winter season ends, we wonder how many corpses will be found after the snow melts.
Thank you, Anais, for that overview. Let's perhaps begin then with the death penalty. So let's have a discussion of death penalty before we move on to some of the other forms of killing that you mentioned. As I mentioned in the introduction for today's event, Belarus is the last country in Europe that still implements the death penalty in practice. Could you give us an idea of what that looks like in practice? What is actually happening in Belarus with regard to the death penalty?
Well, first, I would like to stress that the number of capital punishments carried out in Belarus has been decreasing, and the number of sentences handed out has also been decreasing, which is good news. We don't know exactly the numbers. That's one main issue from our side, is the secrecy that surrounds the death penalty, and therefore even statistics are not clear. But we estimate that it's around 400 people who have been executed since 1991, since the independence of Belarus, and but most of these were carried out in the early 90s as a result of sentences that were handed out at the time of the Soviet Union. Now the rhythm has declined. It's about 1-2 sentences handed out each year and carried out each year. Although, as we know, the death penalty in itself is not unlawful in international human rights law. When it is carried out with violations of fair trial guarantees, then of course there is a source of concern, and the Human Rights Committee has repeatedly found violations of these fair trial guarantees in specifically cases of death penalty being used in Belarus. And Belarus has persistently disregarded the interim measures that were issued by the committee, which requested to stand the executions during the examinations of individual communications. And this has always systematically been ignored. And therefore, the committee has denounced this as a violation by Belarus of its obligations under Article 1 of the first optional protocol to the ICCPR. And unfortunately, the reaction of the government has been 2 years ago to denounce that protocol, and Belarus, which never was part of the second optional protocol, has also withdrawn from the first optional protocol, which is quite exceptional internationally. And therefore, since February 2023, the committee can simply not accept to review individual, and Belarus is also not a member of Europe, because it has maintained the application of death penalty. It refuses to have a moratorium, and in practice, the executions are carried out by shooting. There is no official data on the number of executions, on the day of the execution. Convicts and their families are not informed about the planned date. Usually it's very fast. Actually, for example, in 2011, there was an alleged terrorist attack in the Minsk metro that killed a dozen people. The alleged perpetrators were arrested after 2-3 days. They were sentenced after 2-3 months, and they were killed by the end of the year. So that was extremely fast, in fact, and it raised also a lot of questions, of course, because the investigation was carried out very hurriedly, and of course, again, with no absolutely no fair trial guarantees, no presumption of innocence, no independence of lawyers. And this is a whole additional problem, the situation with lawyers and the fact that they very often have to sign non-disclosure agreements, meaning that they're also unable and not allowed to tell what is going on exactly when the trial is being held behind closed doors, as is often the case since 2020, especially under the pretext of the COVID pandemic, even though in fact in Belarus it has been denied, and maybe you remember the very original way the government has decided not to fight against the infections, and in fact we have also evidence that when in 2020, when so many people were held in pretrial detention centers, in overcrowded cells, and since then, specifically against those who are being detained on political charges, COVID is being used as a weapon, in fact, to make sure people get infected and eventually die in prison or after being released.
Could you tell us a little bit about the recent expansion of the death penalty laws in Belarus and the implications of this under human rights law?
Well, this, of course, goes totally against the historical period where we're living, when abolition is progressing. And Belarus has got in the opposite direction by expanding the legal grounds for death penalty. It introduced death penalty for attempted acts of terrorism and for high treason by public officials and militaries. So this does not meet the requirement of seriousness under Article 6.2 of the Covenant. And furthermore, the Human Rights Committee has interpreted Article 6 of the ICCPR as not allowing states parties to transform into a capital offense any offense that did not entail the death penalty at the time when the covenant was ratified, or in any time thereafter. And these crimes, attempted acts of terrorism or high treason, were not in post-Soviet Belarus subject to death penalty. These legal amendments were introduced in 2022, 2023 in direct reaction, in my view, to the protests that arose in Belarus following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, an aggression in which Belarus is playing an enabling role. This has been recognized as such by the UN General Assembly, and even by Mr. Lukashenko himself. In the media, that yes, his country is a co-aggressor in this war, and many protesters did take part in peaceful protests in February 2022. It's unclear to what extent it was related specifically with the war or with the holding of a new contested electoral process, a constitutional referendum, which was held on 27th of February 2022, and which led, among other things, to erasing from the constitution the article which protected the Belarus's neutral status and non-nuclear status. And as you may know, in fact, since then it's been announced that nuclear weapons will be or are being deployed on Belarusian territory to continue possibly an aggression against Ukraine. And this raises a lot of discontent among the Belarusian population, although after almost 4 years of continuous repression, people are, of course, afraid of protesting publicly offline. But there's been efforts by so-called partisans. So it's they claim that Belarus is being occupied by the Russian military troops who are using the Belarusian territory to carry out this aggression on Ukraine, and therefore some at least 50 people have been arrested for taking part in either cyber attacks against the movement of Russian troops, or the sabotage of the railways that are being used for deploying military equipment and Russian troops through Belarusian territory, and this has been qualified as acts of terrorism or attempted terrorism or planned acts of terrorism. And so of course, the extension of the death penalty in these cases is meant to deter the further resistance, so to say, of Belarusian population to this crime of co-aggression.
Thank you. You mentioned various human rights implications with respect to people that may be sentenced to death, such as fair trial guarantees, potential torture, and also the chilling effects of these new anti-terrorism death penalty laws. Could you maybe give some insight into the impact of the death penalty in Belarus on the families of people that are executed and some of the work of the Human Rights Committee in that space?
We have to remember that a constitutional referendum, with all the quotation marks we should use, because we know also how these procedures are being held in Belarus with the number of violations as well, has given this amazing result that 80% of the population back in 1996 would have been is why the government refrained from abolishing it and claiming that it is more democratic than other countries because they are listening to what the population thinks. In fact, over the decades, this has evolved. The little number of independent opinion polls available, we know that it's about 50-50. And therefore it would be right time to actually open a debate about the abolition and at least a moratorium. This said, the people who are the families, the relatives of people who are victims of death penalty have recalled how hard it is for them, the situation when they're kept uninformed about the date of the execution, about the places of burial. They cannot. Can you imagine that the bodily remains are not returned to the family, and nobody knows where these people are buried or have been eventually cremated, and this causes anguish and mental distress for the families, which also has been, in fact, recognized as amounting to inhuman treatment in violation of Article 7 of the ICCPR.
Thank you. Moving forward then, what are some potential levers that might be pulled to advocate for change in Belarus, given that Belarus has to date really resisted this global trend toward abolition? How might change be realized?
Well, to be very honest with you, after 6 years in this position as special rapporteur, it's hard to remain optimistic. The current political context is absolutely not conducive to abolition. Other than this expansion in law, there are discourses which tend to dehumanize all the people who dare to protest about how things are going in terms of human rights in Belarus. They're called traitors, so even if they're not necessarily prosecuted under this new article regarding treason, and nobody has been sentenced to death penalty for high treason. Nonetheless, there is in public discourses and in the statements of Lukashenko and other people in government this notion that all those who are against these policies or against the governments are against the state itself and are exposing it to for example, it's also now a criminal, it's also a crime now to call for sanctions. And there are many people who have been calling for sanctions over the years and who put it in social media, who put a thumbs up under calls for sanctions, and this creates criminal liability. Can you imagine? So in these circumstances, the general trend is towards the maintenance of the death penalty, possibly the expansion of its application. As I mentioned, there were less sentences issued and carried out in recent years. This trend could change. One very pragmatic reason is that Belarus, now targeted by sanctions since 2020 and even more since 2022 for its co-aggressor role, is increasingly dependent on Russia. Economically, diplomatically, there is an accelerated and deeper integration going on between the two countries, the two societies, the economies, the information space. And if you remember, in Russia itself, now abolition of the moratorium on death penalty is being discussed at the highest level in the parliament, following a public reminder by President Putin that death penalty is not outlawed. And that, again, it's a way of demarcating the so-called Russian world or Eurasian civilization from the decadent West, or whatever, however they want to name it, the collective West with its democratic values and norms of international human rights law norms, which are allegedly expanded to the rest of the world. Well, there is a tendency in the rest of the world. Kazakhstan has abolished the death penalty. And Belarus, unfortunately, with Russia or without, is going in the opposite direction, it seems.
You mentioned earlier both extrajudicial killings occurring in the wake of the protests that erupted across the country in 2020, and then over time, how we are now seeing deaths in custody occurring of these political prisoners. Could you give us a bit more insight into these instances of violence? What actually happened? Why are these deaths in custody in particular occurring? And then what are some of the human rights implications here?
Well, first, you have to know that the relatives of people who are being held for political reasons and people who are who die in prison, well, their relatives who are still in Belarus are under threat. They are they can be victims of retaliation, and that's why, from our perspective, do no harm. We try to make sure that this doesn't happen, and therefore I cannot necessarily quote by name the people who have been who have died in detention as a result, from what we understand, of lack of adequate medical treatment and possibly torture. We are the Belarusian NGOs reported about 13 deaths of people in places of detention, most likely by inadequate or untimely medical care, and 3 additional deaths by November 2023. That's occurred since 2020 upon release from detention due to coronavirus infections. And over the past months, several new reports of deaths in custody have emerged. And according to the OHCHR, again, this examination on Belarus, which is more specialized than I am in these issues, there is reasonable ground to believe that several of them are due to medical negligence, because Belarus, the judiciary and the penitentiary system do not take into account the vulnerability of a detainee, never ever. So if someone has a prior medical condition, or because of age, or somebody who has already an invalidity, for example, or a cancer, will not receive the appropriate treatment in detention. In addition to that, the conditions of detention and the sleep deprivation, for example, is massively used specifically against people who are being detained on political grounds. And I know, unfortunately, many people who are in detention. I mean, they've been friends and colleagues, and they are now behind bars. And some of them have been released. Those who served a shorter sentence of 2 or 3 years, they come out of prison. They don't stay in Belarus for rehabilitation. They leave the country because this is the only chance for them to access also medical treatment and psychological support. And one of them told me that after 1 year, basically he had lost all his teeth. I think it gives a good picture of what can happen in a Belarusian prison. And that was a person who was who didn't suffer from incommunicado detention, and this is not a major source of concern, which in some cases could amount, in fact, to enforced disappearance. Is the tendency over the past 18 months of the penitentiary authorities to sentence detainees to additional punishment, allegedly for petty violations of the prison rules. Again, there is no transparency at all, no access from the lawyers, so it's very hard to know why these people are being sent to punishment cells in solitary confinement. And even though the legislation gives a frame for doing such things, in terms of like having exactly a medical monitoring throughout, and a limitation of the number of days that the person can be in a punishment cell, in fact, people are released for a couple of hours and then sent again. And in many cases, now we have concerns about half a dozen prominent political prisoners from whom we haven't heard for over a year. And this unfortunately raises a lot of questions about whether they're in fact still alive, or maybe have died again as a result of malnutrition, sleep deprivation, hard physical labor. It's also there. Sometimes it's even amounts to slavery in detention that has been evidenced, and lack of proper hygiene as well. Again, this coronavirus issue. So we are very, very concerned about the fate of these people. But as long as their parents or relatives are still in Belarus, it's very, very difficult to we can only raise awareness. We cannot really do much, unfortunately.
As I'm sure some of our audience will know, human rights law conveys both negative and positive obligations. What can you tell us about the positive obligations here to investigate these potential deaths? Is Belarus investigating at all? Or what is this looking like?
From the information available to us, there's never been any investigation. And in fact, the government has also, again, as I said, intimidated relatives upon giving back the corpses, so that they don't ask for an investigation, or they don't ask for an autopsy. But one of the first very famous case in 2021 of a human rights defender, in fact, and civil society activist who died in custody, and he was serving a 5-year prison sentence. And his body was returned full of bandages, and obviously because he had been beaten, in fact. And a video was circulated by the authorities with cuts and showing that how he was falling in the bathroom and things like this and hit himself. But there were people in the room, and we know that violence is widespread and torture is widespread in prison. But again, there's never been any investigation, and as I said, when the death results eventually from lack of medical care for conditions such as cancer, for example, or other disease needing, for example, an operation, there is no smoother treatment of the prisoner at all, in fact, and the lawyers are denied access, and the penitentiary administration can cynically reply to the relatives, to the families, or to the international community that the prisoner has not filed any complaint. Well, of course, he doesn't have a lawyer at hand because most of the lawyers who took on these cases have been disbarred and are in exile. So there is a feeling of abandonment for those who are in prison in Belarus, who were sentenced on political grounds in the context of this post-2020 political protests.
You've also voiced concern about reports of suicides in Belarusian prisons. What obligations does Belarus have under international law with respect to people who do take their own lives?
Well, of course, state parties to the ICCPR have a duty to investigate these kind of allegations when the loss of life occurs in custody, either in unnatural circumstances. Then it creates a presumption of arbitrary deprivation of life by the state authorities. But when it's suicide, of course, the Article 6 of the ICCPR has been analyzed by the Human Rights Committee as implying that under the covenant, states also have an obligation to try and prevent suicides, especially among individuals in particularly vulnerable situations, including individuals who are deprived of their liberty. And that's why any suicide in custody requires a thorough investigation to rule out possibilities of intentional killing or torture. As we know, psychological or physical torture can lead a person to seek to take his own life away, and otherwise that also could amount to a violation of state obligations of investigation under not only Article 6 of the ICCPR but also under Article 12 of the Convention Against Torture.
You mentioned earlier that Belarus has unfortunately withdrawn from the first optional protocol to the ICCPR. In light of that, what other avenues of accountability exists for these violations that we are seeing, either domestically or internationally?
Well, domestically, unfortunately, for as long as the justice system is not reformed fully, there is no real hope for things to change and for impunity to stop and for perpetrators to be held to account. That is why all eyes are now on the international community, on the possibilities of universal jurisdiction, because, well, I would like to call for the establishment of a special tribunal for the crimes committed in 2020. But as we know, at the UN level, it will be extremely hard because the Security Council has permanent members, two of which will likely use their veto against the establishment of any kind of such tribunal for Belarus. That is why now we are looking at possibilities entailed by the procedures that were launched in several countries, surrounding countries where Belarusians have massively fled into exile over the past years, because there is an obligation for these states that do have universal jurisdiction to prosecute, in particular, alleged crimes against humanity. And it happens that this mechanism which I evoked, this OHCHR examination on Belarus, which has been renewed since 2021, and this year changed into a new mechanism, a group of experts specifically tasked with issuing recommendations on accountability. And this OHCHR examination on Belarus has concluded in its March 2023 report that some of the violations that occurred in the context of the 2020 elections could amount to crimes against humanity under international customary law. And that is why, since there is no reasonable expectation that justice would be delivered for these violations inside Belarus, it's up to the other countries to prosecute or to extradite, to prosecute these crimes in their country, with the limitation, of course, that the perpetrators are safely staying in Belarus, that they will not be extradited, the government will not cooperate with the investigations. And in fact, there is this paradox that most of the perpetrators are in fact targeted by individual sanctions. They have a visa ban, and there is no chance of them crossing a border to a country where they could be apprehended. So that's a bit cynical. This said, there has been an initiative which I would like to remind, that in May 2021, a coalition of NGOs have asked the ICC prosecutor to initiate an investigation under Article 15.2 of the Rome Statute into possible crimes against humanity of deportation and persecution on political grounds. And although Belarus is not a part of the Rome Statute, this could open a way for the International Criminal Court to look into this crime of deportation, because there's been hundreds of thousands of people who have been compelled to exile. I dedicated one of my reports to this. Now the numbers, depending on the estimations, is between 500,000 and 1 million people. And so this request also is topical because it relies on I mean, it has chances of delivering if the prosecutor accepts it, because it builds on the precedent of the Rohingya minority. If you remember, in 2019, the third pretrial chamber of the ICC authorized the prosecutor to investigate these alleged crimes against humanity of deportation and persecution committed in Myanmar against the Rohingya Muslim minority, considering that part of the actus reus of the alleged crimes occurred in the territory of a state party to the ICC, Bangladesh, where these people had massively flown and found refugee. And so this would be sufficient for the court to exercise transboundary jurisdiction. And the same could apply for Poland, Lithuania, Georgia, Ukraine, which one way or another recognize the competence of the court and would cooperate with it should the prosecutor decide to move on, building on this communication he received. Unfortunately, in the meantime, as we know, this full-scale war in Ukraine has taken attention away from and resources away from Belarus, and now all the focus is on Ukraine. That's why we are really hoping that national tribunals in the host countries would do their part. I know there are investigations underway, and one of the obstacles, again, cynically enough, is that the prosecutors could not transfer the official communications, official letters to the alleged perpetrators, to the suspects in Belarus, because there's no more postal services communications between the two countries.
Thank you so much. I would like to move on now to a brief discussion of your reflections on your mandate, as this is your final year in the office. And we have received quite a few questions from the audience, so I'll do my best to incorporate these. So could you give us a brief overview of what your experience in the mandate has been, any potential hurdles you may have encountered, and one of our guests would like to know what has it been like actually doing country visits in Belarus?
Well, the mandate, sorry, I should have specified it from the onset, that the government of Belarus has maintained a policy of non-recognition and non-engagement with the mandate, meaning that since its inception in 2012, the mandate holder has never been allowed inside the country on an official visit. In fact, I've been blacklisted since for a long time, and even academic visit, unofficial visit, which was sort of being discussed informally in 2019, could never take place. Therefore, for lack of access, of course, the conditions to discharge my mandate are difficult, because we have to maintain a high level of transparency nonetheless, and use the standard procedures for double checking, verifying allegations that we receive. And without being granted access, it's extremely difficult. However, since 2020, the massive human rights crisis, which I mentioned, has led to a massive exile of victims or their relatives. I coincidentally had more opportunities for meeting them and getting first-hand testimonies from victims, especially in Warsaw, where I live. It's very near the border. It's one of the top to start a new life in safety, but not being too far from Belarus either. And well, one of the hurdles, I would say, is that I'm a political scientist. I was not trained to process the information that was literally poured on me in 2020, from August till, well, for the following year or so, when there was very high demand on the mandate, because there was international attention. So I was also requested to give interviews to media, like tens a day for 2 months, and but at the same time receiving in my mailbox, on my Facebook, direct testimonies from victims who were turning to me for help, sending without filters videos, photos, pictures of their wounds, and telling me their stories. And like I was like a sponge. Unfortunately, I could not. I was feeling so much empathy that basically I was burnt out after a while, because you need to have special training to process these kind of information. And unfortunately, it was also a year when nobody could really have much support from the UN among the independent experts because of the COVID. And as you know, I discharged my mandate pro bono. There was never an issue about this. I knew that it's an unpaid job, but on the other hand, when the amount of work is multiplied by 10 overnight, and you also have no possibility to travel to Geneva because nobody could travel in 2020. That made it very, 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 very hard actually to seek appropriate support from the institution, including I would say psychological support. Yes.
Moving forward, then, what is your vision for the mandate in your last year, and then for whoever will take this position after you?
Well, I I'm very happy that it has been prolonged, that the resolution was passed already in March, to renew it after I leave office on 1st of November. So in the meantime, somebody will be appointed indeed. If there are any volunteers, I am ready to to share insights and write recommendation letters for any good, genuine candidates, because it has to be somebody who really cares for human rights and who speaks Russian, ideally, or Belarusian even. And unfortunately, we can expect that some people speaking these languages will apply massively and without being really concerned about human rights. We've got this experience based on the recruitment procedure for the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Russian Federation, the new mandate that was established last year. And so there's always the risk that the mandate is discontinued, because it's not as permanent as thematic mandates are. It's renewed year on year. On the chain, there is always also this risk. But I'm absolutely convinced that this mandate is necessary, and quite confident that the international community, that democracies that do care about the situation in Belarus, who have read my reports and know how I've been working, and that it's not what the Belarusian government claims. It's not fiction literature. It is indeed evidence-based evidence, really, of massive human rights violations that do deserve attention, and hopefully some solutions will come about sooner than later.
Absolutely. One final question from our audience. You mentioned that the mandate holder is not welcome to enter Belarus. In light of this, could you give us a bit of insight into what the civil society is like in Belarus at the moment? Obviously, you have spoken about the suppression and the difficulties in performing any kind of advocacy, but could you maybe give us some more insight into that and how the situation may change moving forward?
Well, as I said, at least 10% of the population is now living outside of Belarus for its own safety. This is the civil society I'm most used to cooperating with. And as we know, it's not necessarily representative, because it's the people who are the most politically active, the ones who do care about human rights. And we know that inside Belarus proper, there also is a core third, probably, of the population that is supportive of the government and its policies. Not 80% as the electoral results would show, but still there is a critical mass that do support all this. So in that sense, they would claim that that life is good in Belarus, and that people feel safe, and etc. I know for sure, for being very well integrated in numerous discussion fora that have developed since 2020, in fact, on Telegram, the so-called Telegram channels. I monitor like hundreds of them daily. I know quite well how people are feeling about what is going on, meaning that the space for civic activism has been totally eradicated. I mean, like, all civil society organizations that did have a little civic or political color have been forced to dissolve, or they were dissolved by a court decision. The KGB still has this name, the state police. The KGB maintains a list of extremist material, three lists: extremist material, extremist individuals, and extremist organizations. And with all this, it has outlawed, basically, and outcasted all the dissident voices in the country. And among the people whom we see arriving, like every week here in Belarus, in Poland, in Warsaw, we get a phone call. How can somebody help? This family to rent a flat, get their children to school, etc. What we hear is even people who were not politicized, who were not, even those who didn't take part in the protests in 2020, are leaving the country because they say it's dead. That they, like, all their friends have been either arrested or compelled to exile. Their colleagues, the school programs have been changed. The universities have been purged. The neighbors have left. The coffee shops have cafes and restaurants have closed down. Exhibition centers, concert halls do not show any interesting bands anymore. So this whole atmosphere is suffocating. And so that is why you have this sort of dichotomia between what is going on in the country and what is being showcased about the country in official media, in propaganda, and this embryo or remnants of civil society, which is being reconstituted abroad in exile, also in very difficult circumstances, including discrimination since 2022, since February 2022, because in many countries, Belarus, being a Belarusian passport holder is a huge embarrassment. And these people who have already suffered repression at home, exile, sometimes many of them went to Ukraine in exile. Then because of the war, they had to relocate again. And they are being considered, formally or not, as co-aggressors, and they are victims of the counter effect of sanctions that are not targeted enough to protect them from further violations and discriminations upon trying to enter a university, opening a bank account, and these kind of things. So, but I would really like to underline that this civil society is resilient. It has not lost hope after 30 years of authoritarian rule, and it has remained peaceful. And this is extremely important. And this is what makes me hopeful that when change arrives and people can come back safely and rebuild their country under new regulations that would be compliant with democracy and human rights, they won't be the same vengeance as the government has displayed towards them, towards all those who do not support its policies.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anais, for your time today and for sharing your insights.
You.
I think that does bring us to the end